The World Economic Forum has classified climate change as the greatest threat to the global economy. In Zimbabwe, we are seeing it manifest itself in the form of extreme and irregular weather patterns. What is the government doing to mitigate this crisis? Find out next when I speak to the National Coordinator on Climate Change, Professor Prosper Matondi. Prof, great to have you on the program. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Farah, for this interview.
Let's begin by looking at, towards the tail end of 2022, we know that the COP27 summit was held. What were some of the key decisions that came out of that meeting?
Yeah, I think let's start from where we started from. We went to COP27 with a very high optimism. There are quite a number of issues that we wanted to look at. One of them was on climate financing, because we had reached a point where we were disappointed that the amount agreed, the 100 million that was offered by parties, was not on the table. We were also looking at energy in view of the geopolitical changes across the globe, and we said, what are the key solutions that we needed? We also were faced to issues to do with adaptation and mitigation, as well as linking that to the low emissions development strategy and our NDCs. And we thought that that was an opportune moment to take that review, because the COP27 in Egypt was an implementation COP. Probably that was the beginning of what we call implementation for climate change. So those are the issues that mattered to us. But the outcome of it, of course, different. The issues where decisions were made were particularly on loss and damage, and that was our issue. It was a developing country issue. It was an African issue. It was also a Zimbabwean issue, because the deep impact of climate change affects people in terms of death, but also affects property, affects the future of young children, affects everybody, and so forth. So we were worried with those, and we negotiated intensely until we reached a decision.
What do you mean when you say loss and damage?
When we say loss and damage, the climate crisis comes in different forms. It might be too much rain than needed. It might be floods. It might be hurricanes that come with enormous intensity over a short period of time. It might be the destruction of ecosystems and so on. So that climate crisis contributes to the destruction of property and human life. And therefore, loss and damage is what is the result. The idea behind this particular fund was then to say, can we come up with a body or a pool of resources where we can do compensation for that loss and damage right across the board, because climate crisis affects both developed and developing countries. But for Zimbabwe, we are affected more because of our circumstances, and that needs to be considered in an architecture of a loss and damage fund like the one that we came up with. And for me, that was a significant outcome.
Who funds this pot of money that will provide compensation for loss and damage?
Parties to the NRtv have got a responsibility, just as the same responsibility they did for the 100 billion. They have to pay up for the fund. But I think we don't need to be boggled out about who pays. We needed to get the principles understood and accepted by all parties, and that was done. Now the question is, how do we now roll out the fund? And different ways and approaches can then be used to be able to do so. But what I want to say is that, of course, this is loss and damage is a fund. The idea of a fund is good, but the idea of having money to pay for death, we might not find it comfortable, most of us, because you can't compensate for death. For instance, you can compensate for property, but you can't compensate for lost opportunities for people who have died or for those whose infrastructure have gone under. Let's say if it's a school, a hospital, and so forth that is affected by a hurricane or a cyclone or heavy rainfalls, the school is gone. The immediate inclination for us is to go and rebuild. The fund gives us the opportunity for us to be able to intervene and bring resources to where it is needed most. But it does not mean that we are going to fully reconstruct the life of those people as they were before the crisis. No, that cannot be done. But over a period of time, yes, we might get things right. But we are saying that some effect of the deep nature of the climate crisis necessitates us to have a fund of some kind that will then help communities and also help state structures, private sector, and all players to rebuild and reconstruct their life. And it was overdue.
While we're still on this issue of global agreements and where we are as a community of nations, what has Zimbabwe signed up to? What are our obligations under this issue of climate change?
Yes, we've signed up to the UNFCCC, probably one of the founders of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change since the 1990s. And we have been a participant all the way. And in the process, each time a COP comes, there is an agreement that is signed. We signed for the Kyoto Protocol in 2007. But also we also signed for the Paris Agreement in 2015. And we signed the Forest Pledge at Glasgow just in 2021. We signed for that as well. And what we are signing for is our full appreciation and acknowledgement that Zimbabwe is part of a collective of nations that are trying to solve the climate crisis.
Have we met our obligations?
Yes, we have made our obligations. For us, we have got the climate policy in place. We have our national development contributions. We have got our low emissions development strategy. We have got our climate response strategy. We have our climate communications. All those rafts of policies are aimed at ensuring that we do the right thing. We participate globally, but also we take action locally. So our idea now is how to mainstream climate change across the whole of government. So that must be done. And in addition, we need to create greater awareness amongst our people what climate change is all about. Because in often systems, these are large-scale impactful systems. People don't understand the impact or where it is coming from and how to manage it. And the role of government, in this case, and signing up to this convention, is to precisely be able to do that.
Let me stop you there for now, Prof. We're going to take a short break. Do stay with us. We'll be back to continue this discussion shortly. Welcome back to the program. Thank you for staying with us. Now, Prof, before we went to the break, you had mentioned the fact that there is a loss and damage fund that was set up and funds would be availed to countries that are affected by climate crises and emergencies. But the other point, I think what's important is to make sure that perhaps communities are not in a position where they can adapt to be more resilient and be more prepared for some of these crises so they aren't as badly affected as we've seen in the past. Is that one of the priorities you're putting in place going forward?
It is a key priority, and the reason why we have our Vision 2030 and also our National Development Strategy in order to address some of the deep impact of climate change. In the context of a whole of government approach, our budgeting system is centered on climate. We say the epicenter of planning in this country is based on climate because we are looking at that climate now and into the future. Well, the implications of that is that all ministries are then expected to have a climate component. And if they don't have, we're there to help them to be able to do so. Our idea is that they must allocate resources, be it in the state provinces. They must allocate resources for climate change so that they are able to adapt and mitigate the effect of climate change within their own locality. So if a school is damaged in Gwanda, for instance, you must have sufficient response mechanisms for Gwanda to be able to address that. But as government, we are then coming to say we need to back up that up with specific resources that comes from Treasury, but also mobilized from international parties.
I was going to come to that point where I was saying, are there adequate resources to be able to mount these responses? So you mentioned Treasury will chip in, international partners will chip in. Are they willing to come to the party?
Yes, they are very much willing. And for all these years of 27 of participating in the Conference of Parties, we have worked with the development partners, a variety of them. We have funded resilience programs on the ground. We have funded adaptation and coping strategies across the nation. We have come up with different models on food systems, for instance, that are climate resilience. And of course, we back that up with our own large-scale programs. For instance, the reason why the country is food secure in the view of climate change is because we introduced appropriate programs like Vumvunza, Intwasa, and so forth that is now going for growth after its implementation over the last few years. Having achieved food security allows you then to then say what other elements of climate change do we want to address, and for that we have got an answer. The country is putting 12 large dams in the country right now as we speak in order to back up our water system, and the water question is a climate question as well. If we address that, we are then able to address many of the challenges that we face for domestic water, for agriculture, and so forth.
A lot of what you're talking about, obviously, because you are in government, speaks to the role that government is playing and the measures being put in place. What is the role of private sector in all this?
We expect a very strong role of the private sector, but we don't want them punished for things that they didn't do. The reason why I'm saying so is because Zimbabwe is not a net emitter of emissions. Our emissions per capita are about 0.07 metric tons. That's insignificant per household, per person. That's insignificant at all. So we are not contributing to emissions. And therefore, our private sector cannot be repurposed when they are not the net emissions of emissions. But be that as it may, we are saying that they need to create efficiencies. That we need cleaner production systems across our private sector, especially in industry. But we also want to draw the private sector companies to come in and play a role by funding. And for that, we've got a variety of proposals. Climate financing is one aspect of it. And we've got carbon credits that is gone bonkers worldwide in terms of the stock market performance just in the recent few months. So we are saying that the private sector can draw some of those resources from carbon credits markets in an effort to reduce emissions. So that's potential funding for the private sector that they can put for developing their sector and so forth, and also contributing to the mitigation agenda. But Farah, I want to mention something, that a private sector capacity cannot be drawn fully without addressing fundamentals to do with energy. For instance, the country is in a deep crisis around energy, but we have got answers there too. Whilst we are saying we are going for the face down on coal and continue using coal until 2030, we are actually repurposing coal for other purposes. For that, we are increasing the amount of support that we provide to renewable energy, in particular solar. And you already know that in the market we have intervened on lithium because it is one of the ingredients that we use for making batteries. So we've banned exports, but not really banned exports, but saying that you can't export concentrates. And those concentrates are the ones that we now use for the manufacture of batteries. So if we do that, we are able to both to export, but also to develop our local industry for the manufacturing of batteries, which is a huge component, an expensive component for your solar. Once we've done that and bring in other solutions, then we are able to say across the country, how do we ensure that we solarize for the nation in order to meet their energy needs. It might not be incomplete, but it's something that can then help the country. So those are some of the solutions that can be provided by private sector, and we want green jobs, and green jobs can come with climate change.
Let's talk a bit about, you made mention of coal, and specifically here, very quickly, would love to hear your thoughts on the fact that we see now globally, some of these countries that have been paying us billions of dollars to steer away and move away from coal, now turning back to it because of the geopolitics you made mention of earlier. Will this not retard the climate change effort and fight?
I think we are in a stage of a deep crisis, especially in terms of global economic recession, which has been affected first by the COVID circumstances. Then, of course, the Russia-Ukraine crisis comes. Then you've got the intense climate impact, and that is drawn back most of the country's economies. So what do you do in that case? You've got Germany, UK, Australia, all these countries are opening their coal plants because of that gap that has been created. South Africa is under pressure to open itself, and they got funding just before COP27 to be able to do so. And we were implementing our Hungary 7 and 8, and they are about to be opened. But for us, as we do so, we said we are using more or less cleaner types of plants that are using for energy purposes for fossils, but that's not good enough. The good enough is to probably completely stop, which we can't, because that will knock the economy, it will come to a halt. And for that, we are in a face down. We are agreeable with cabinet and the president to say, as we use our coal, let's also be aware that it won't be the main source of our energy into the future. Therefore, other sources of energy have to be ratcheted up and developed. So I think we have got an answer to that. Then on the hydro, of course, Kariba North and Kariba South are significant players. But as climate hits, we expect that there will be much less rainfall over a period of time. What we've done is that across the 10 provinces, we've now developed at least a large dam with the potential for energy production. They might not produce as much, but they will produce enough that probably can meet their province. And if they are complementary other IPP producers, independent power producers, that can do so. So those are some of the answers we have where the private sector can play a role.
We'll come back and pick up this discussion. Prof, very intense, very engaging. Do stay with us. We'll return shortly. Welcome back. The discussion continues. I am speaking to Professor Prosper Matondi. He's the National Coordinator on Climate Change. He's also Chief Director to Environment and Climate Services in the Ministry of Environment, Climate, Tourism and Hospitality Industry. Quite a mouthful there, quite a handful. Speaks to the magnitude of the job you have on your hands. Earlier, you talked about carbon credits, and as you said, it's the in thing, it's the buzzword globally. For the uninitiated, what do you mean when you say carbon credits, and where is the opportunity there for businesses and communities to make money?
Yes, for the uninitiated, we need to educate them. And so, yes, carbon credit is one of the vehicles and mechanisms for addressing climate change, but it's not new. In 2007, we signed up to the Kyoto Protocol, and within that, there was a decision that the net emitters needed to be helped in terms of their emissions. And therefore, the Kyoto Protocol came up with a clean development mechanism where there are compliant markets in the developed countries who can sell to each other in terms of emissions. The one who's not emitting can buy from someone else, so that at least there's equivalent in terms of the emissions. So that's how the credit market developed in Europe. That same market also then added a component of what is called the voluntary carbon market. Your voluntary carbon market is that where you then sell from a developed entity to a lesser developed country. So Zimbabwe can trade with US, with Europe, with the other countries, with companies across the globe in order to, because their emissions market are exhausted. So they are looking for other markets elsewhere. So they come to our markets that are underdeveloped. So that's essentially what is happening. So for that, now there are greater opportunities for us to participate, especially the private sector companies. But there must be a whole governance system. And for now, the UNFCCC manages the credit management system, and below it are a multiplicity of actors that govern or are brokers, where you actually register the carbon and then go on the stock market and then compete or trade. So you've got Vera, you've got Gold Standard, Goldman and Sachs, you've got Carbon Air. There are just a lot of them. But their role is then to document, to measure, and where you put your credit that are eligible on that particular platform. So that market is now developing. And when I was looking at how the market fashioned from last year, Shanghai opened its carbon stock exchange in June last year. The stock market was performing extremely well. Canada and some few countries also opened theirs last year as well. Europe has always had a market that is functional. In the Middle East, there are several stock markets that are also working. So the rate of the carbon is where it's contested. For instance, on the carbon trading market in Zimbabwe and in the region, the amounts paid are between $2 to $3. But on some of those markets in the Middle East, they were ranging up to $9. But the bed markets can go up to $100. So there's just simply confusion because the carbon market has got no governance system. People are using the voluntary mechanism because it's a convenient route to run away from the responsibilities. So our idea is now that Zimbabwe does not have a carbon credit firm. We are developing one, and soon you'll be hearing more about it. What is our idea? Our idea is that a carbon credit market must have rules for it to work. Most of the players of interest are coming for the forests, to say that if we go into forests and we protect, conserve this forest, then we're able to offload the carbons, right? But the forests and the vegetation is owned by somebody else who's seated there. It's a local community. What are the net benefit for that community, that mother, that child who stays with the forest? Who stays with wild animals and so forth? You're talking about wildlife as well as biodiversity. Does all those things? So that's where we've got a problem in terms of the proportion of benefits for the investor or the proponent, for the communities, for the rural district councils, for the national designated authority, which is our ministry. We get a small percentage for managing the whole system. For also for the national registry, we are required to come up with a national registry where we log in our data on the carbon emissions to ensure their authenticity and so forth. So it's something that we need to work on.
You mentioned earlier as well green jobs that will emerge. What are some of these?
I said earlier on in mining, when you mine lithium and other resources around that, and you start producing batteries, you then trigger the creation of jobs. These are green jobs because you are contributing to the renewable energy agenda. In the agriculture sector, we are going for growth. And we started off with Mfuvuza in Swasa as a basis for ensuring food security. So the idea of green jobs is the way to go into the future, because it allows us to reduce our net carbon emissions and also contribute to the global goals on climate change.
Very lastly, Prof, and I'm going to put you on the spot here, are we winning this climate change war?
Yeah, I would say the question is a yes and the answer no. I'm disappointed with the global discourse on climate change. We do intense negotiations around these elements that I said earlier on, but most often we're unable to find an answer. If you ask me, our president signed for the forestry pledge at COP26 in Glasgow. What have we done about it? Not much, really. And yes, just last year, we signed up to the Loss and Damage Fund. And our expectation is that by now we should be talking about numbers and figures. And sometimes it's disappointing because we don't even actually know where to start from. And I was trying to encourage the other day the private sector to come in and start playing and start to play a role. So the question around the global agreements, and they suffer basically from lack of implementation. You have got very good plans. You spend more time in workshop trying to crunch the numbers on science. In Bonn, where most of the scientific-based science is done. But numbers mean something for people. If you continue giving them an NDC, for instance, a global stock check, you're talking about numbers. People want action to address their crisis. But I guess the solution to that crisis comes from the intense impact of climate change in the spaces of the developed countries. And I want to run you quickly through some of that. Hurricane Ian in the US, I said earlier on that the property lost in USA and Cuba was around $103 billion. Pakistan, 30% of the country was under floods, and they lost 1,700, and the budget was 5.6 billion. China was also under floods for the first time for the last 50 years, and their budget was about $12.3 billion. And we are talking about the Horn of Africa, Kenya, Ethiopia, Eritrea. They suffer inordinate drought, and 36 million right now people I need food aid. To give money as an indicator will not be the right thing to do, but it's necessary to do. I'm saying so because the figures I'm giving are the sum assured, where you can go to your company and claim that money. But there's so much within climate change that is not insured. We can't insure everything. In Africa, our insurance system don't work, so we don't know the amount. That's the reality. We don't know the amount of loss and damage. If a school goes in Rwanda, I can make a good guesstimate to say to construct a school like that cost 40,000. But at the end, I have not calculated the livelihoods of the person impacted. This child, this mother, the child is not going to school for the next month or so. I can't calculate that. We don't have format for that. So those are the issues that then affect us locally. We are still struggling with Cyclone Idai right now. We are still victims of Cyclone Idai. We have not been addressed because we don't have good formulas to deal with all of that. But that must not discourage us. We must try to do more as a global collective.
Thank you so much, Prof. And hopefully we can continue to come back and measure those milestones and achievements as you make them.
Okay, thank you so much, Farai.
Thank you.